We're back with another episode of App Stories brought to you today by ZocDoc. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Vitici. Hey, Tici.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well. We had a little therapy session in the pre-show today.
I loved it. It's non-tech stuff. Well, it's maybe semi-related because we talked about social media, but in a more personal way. Yeah.
Personal discussion about social media and my struggles with it in particular, which have been on my mind a little bit in the past few weeks. And I don't know. We had a good talk about it though, because I think you handle it quite well. But
thank you.
You're welcome. If you're interested in the pre-show where we talk about such things, you can subscribe to App Stories Plus by going to appstories.plus. That's our extended ad-free version of the show that comes out early every week in high bitrate audio. It's available as a standalone subscription or as part of Club Premier, which is our top tier of Club Mac Stories that comes with all the great stuff from Club Mac Stories Plus, as well as App Stories Plus. You get basically all the extended content that we do at Mac Stories. Federico, today's topic is iPadOS 17 and our wishes. And I know you've got a lot of wishes. I had fewer wishes. I was struggling a little bit. But I want to talk to you a little bit about some updates and follow-up before we get into the main topic today.
Yeah, you have some follow-up about the phone app, which is apparently one of your most used apps on your phone.
It's one of my least used apps on the phone, which is why I got things a little bit wrong. I will admit to not being perfect when it comes to thinking about these things. And what happened to me is I thought the scrubber didn't work on voicemail, and it turns out it does. It's just incredibly tiny little grabber that's really hard to get hold of, and you can actually use it. So now I know. Now I will scrub through my voicemails with ease. Well, maybe not with ease because it is a tiny little touch target, but I'll still be able to do it. And then the other thing I mentioned was not being able to bulk delete voicemails. And this is kind of in between, because what I want to do, and I should have explained it better, is I want to use the 2-finger selection gesture that you find in other places like the Files app, where you can just, long press on a particular item and then 2-finger swipe down to select a bunch of them and delete them all at once. What you have to do with the phone app is you have to do that long press, and then you have to tap them individually. And since I had something like 80 of them, I tapped 80 times. And now, you know what? My voicemail is empty, except for one voicemail I got just the other day. But other than that, it's I'm living a new, clean, start over lifestyle in the phone app.
Nice. You have inbox 0 or voicemail almost 0 in the phone app.
Voicemail 0. Now all the spammers can start filling it back up, because I don't know about you, but I get a lot of spam calls. I get like 5 or 6 a day now.
Oh my God. It's gotten so bad. Yeah, it's gotten so bad in Italy. And I'm using Truecaller because I know there's a popular one in the US.
Does it work?
It does work to an extent. It's of all the blockers in Italy, at least. I know that in America you have Robo, whatever. It doesn't.
Yeah, I've used that before in the past, but I gave up because I don't know, they weren't working as well.
Truecaller, I've been having a really good experience with it. It does a very good job, especially at identifying like carrier-related spam. I don't know why it's so aggressive over here, like all these cell phone providers with these spam calls. And, they trick the system now. They trick the system in Italy because they call you from another cell phone number. And so it looks like maybe you're getting a call from a real person that's not in your address book. And now you gotta take a leap of faith basically every time you get one of these calls. Like, is it gonna be like, I don't know, a worker that's supposed to get some work done at my house, or is a cell phone provider?
Right. Well, and that's because, and I wanted to mention that. I'm glad you mentioned that, because people, whenever we talk about this, they will tell me, why don't you just turn off the unknown callers thing? And it's like, well, you really can't especially like you and I, where we've just moved recently and we have a lot of people coming to our house and appointments and things. I'll get calls from doctors. I'll get calls from people who are going to work on my house, all sorts of things where you just don't know what the phone number is going to be that they're calling from. And then you don't get the call. And sometimes they're important calls. So I haven't been able to turn that on for quite a while now since I moved. But the benefit of moving is that now that I'm in a new area code, a lot of my spam calls still come from my old area code because, they do the thing where they try to spoof being someone in your neighborhood or something. They use the area codes for the Chicago area. So I'll think it's, a neighbor or something. Well, I don't live there anymore, spammers. So I never answer those Chicago calls because anybody who still lives in Chicago who I know and talk to will, they're in my contact list and I'll be able to see who's calling. So, all right. Anything else on the phone app, Federico?
No, I don't have anything on the phone app myself. I just
it's a you know what it is? You know what they call the phone app? They call it a design playground.
This is not true. Who? Spammers, maybe. Spammers they use the phone app a lot, I bet. The spam people, but nobody calls it that. It's not a design playground. I'm sorry.
Has the phone app even really changed much?
No.
I'm trying to think about the last time the phone
iOS
app got
7. That's the last time it changed. iOS.
Yeah,
well, maybe
the
design of the contact card has changed a bunch over the years. Maybe in iOS
True
12. I want to say, and obviously dark mode in iOS 13. But that's it. Really,
Look at you, the expert on the phone app. I'm impressed.
Anyway, so we should talk iPadOS 17. That's the next major update to iPadOS, and we gotta address the elephant in the room up front, I guess. Last year, when we recorded this episode, I was primarily an iPad user. This year, as we are recording this episode, I am, after many years of absence, primarily a Mac user. And that's because as has been widely documented on Mac Stories, App Stories, and on my other show Connected on Relay FM, over the past few months, I've been really struggling with iPadOS 16. It all started with the Stage Manager betas last summer, and this issue, sort of this identity crisis that I had with my usage of iPadOS, got worse through subsequent months, and it led me to this journey of rediscovery of technology around me, eventually settling on a MacBook Air with the M2 as my main computer. But the elephant in the room for me is not just that, oh, now you're using a Mac, you used to be an iPad user, whatever. The issue for me is this, that deeply inside of me, I know that if I could choose in an hypothetical future between a Mac, like the one I'm looking at right now, a traditional laptop, or the kind of modular computer that I really would like Apple to make. So if Apple came up to me and said, look, if we did all these things in iPadOS, would you come back? And I know that deep inside of me, my answer would be yes. Because at a core level, I know that hypothetically, if certain things came true, that's the kind of computer I want. In fact, right now, my feeling is that right now, the kind of computer I want is a MacBook Air with touch. Because ultimately, if given the chance and, the ability to choose my future on Apple platforms, I would say, yeah, make this computer for me. It should be an iPad that can be as flexible as a Mac when it comes to software. Like, that's my dream machine. So this episode is interesting because my wishes are going to be the things that I would love to see in iPadOS, things that if they became available, I would switch back, no questions asked. Because that computer can already be both a tablet and a quote-unquote laptop, but the problem is the software. So that's my context for all of this. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I mean, it's interesting, going into this myself, is that I've probably used my iPad Pro less in the last year than I have at any time, really. I mean, and part of that was, I guess, the Mac Studio. Part of that is Apple Silicon, because Apple Silicon Macs are so good that I've just really enjoyed using my Mac Studio and my M1 MacBook Air for my general computing needs. And so it definitely took away some of the time for me from using the iPad. But it does go deeper than that, because I think there is it's not my feelings about the iPad and its OS aren't as strong as yours, but that's primarily because I've never been an iPad first user. It's always been a complement and a secondary part of how I use my Apple devices. But I also had the same kind of disappointment with it in that I really hoped that especially I'd be able to use the iPad better with an external display. And I find like Stage Manager in particular, I think the implementation of the external display is the part that really bothers me the most at the end of the day.
Yeah. So Stage Manager. So I'm gonna tackle all these wishes in a way that like these are problems that I have while working on the iPad. So if anybody at Apple is listening, I'm taking a very practical approach here. So Stage Manager, you mentioned the external display, and I agree. The first thing that comes to mind is I cannot use my iPad Pro with Stage Manager on an external display in clamshell mode. If I want to use my iPad at my desk and just look at the display, I gotta waste space on my physical desk because the iPad needs to stay open and unlocked.
Right.
I should be able to close the smart keyboard, the Magic Keyboard or the Folio on top of the iPad screen like I can do with a MacBook, connect a cable, and use my iPad in clamshell mode on an external display.
It would give you the added benefit of better battery life too if you weren't connected to powers.
And
right? That would be a great thing.
The display wouldn't age or whatever. Like it's just you're saving power. It's also good for the environment if you think about it. Because I'm not looking at the display, so it's drawing power that it's not being used at all. So even from a carbon emission standpoint, I think it makes sense. You just turn off that display because I don't need to look at it. So clamshell mode is the big one for me.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by ZocDoc. When somebody's really good at what they do, it could be a waiter, a chef, a doctor, you're in good hands. It's like seeing that waiter balance 5 trays of sizzling fajitas on one arm. You're confident in them. When you find the right doctor, you can feel it. You feel heard and at ease. On ZocDoc, finding the doctor that's right for you is seamless. The quality care you need is just a few taps away in the ZocDoc app. ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. When you move somewhere new, it's really hard to find the care that you're looking for. You need to find all new doctors, and it can be a lot, especially if you're doing it for not just yourself, but also a family, which is the position I found myself in. When I moved to North Carolina, I was looking for new doctors for myself, for my wife, for my kids. And you know what? It was a little bit overwhelming. And I looked at the ZocDoc app, and it took a lot of that anxiety away because it really is easy to find someone you need. It's easy to search. It's easy to figure out what insurance they take, everything. It's a really simple app to use. And as they say, you can usually find someone who can take you and see you, which can be really important when you're not feeling your best. When you're not feeling your best and just trying to hold everything together, finding great care shouldn't take up all of your energy. And that's where ZocDoc comes in. Using their free app that millions of users have relied on, you can find the right doctor that meets your needs and fits your schedule. Book an appointment with a few taps in their app and start feeling better faster with ZocDoc. Go to ZocDoc.com/appstories to download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/appstories. ZocDoc.com/appstories. Our thanks to ZocDoc for their support of the show.
Stage Manager, I think what I would like Apple to do is uncouple Stage Manager, the feature, from multitasking and multi-window, the idea. I think I would be okay with Apple leaving Stage Manager as a mode for people who want it, maybe even leave it like it is. Just it's Stage Manager, it's this way of doing multitasking. But I would also do what they do on macOS and just do regular multi-window that it's not called Stage Manager, So I would actually prefer to have an iPadOS 17 where you have 3 modes. You have split view slide over, stage manager, and, traditional multi-window. I don't know what you want to call it. But give me the option, if you really want to make it a modular thing, let me choose my mode, and it's fine. And with that kind of multi-window, something I would like to do is remove the limit of 4 windows up on screen at the same time. That's a current limitation of Stage Manager. I want to be able to use more than 4 windows. Broadly speaking, and this will require, I'm guessing, maybe a major rewrite of how iPad software is made. But I would love to have regular resizing of windows. Instead of, when you resize a window in Stage Manager for iPadOS, and if you pay attention, you can see that you're resizing. It's like resizing on a slider. You have all these different steps. Those are the size classes. You can't really resize with pixel-based precision.
No, it's presets, basically.
It's presets.
It's a system of presets. And I think for me, where that is most glaring and difficult is on an external display. It bothers me far more when I have my iPad hooked up to an external screen than it does on the iPad. I don't like it either place, but to me, it makes using an external display almost unusable.
Yep. And same, what makes it really challenging to use an external display is the default snapping behavior. I appreciate the Stage Manager tries to make the life of a lot of people easy by taking care on your behalf of placing windows and repositioning windows so that you can always see all the windows that you have on screen. But personally, and especially when I'm using my iPad Pro with the studio display, just let me choose. I want to be the master of my workspace. Let me choose exactly where I want to drag a window and don't ever move them from under my cursor. Don't ever move them on my behalf. Just let me choose, let me drag it here and stay there. Never move.
Federico, another thing that we're going to talk about more when it comes to Mac OS, but I feel like in both places, Apple really needs to give users more options and ways to manage those stages, building up the stages, saving the stages, accessing the stages. It's just... so much is automated in a way and at the expense of users who want to set things up in a particular way, which is a very similar, I think, critique to your issue about, being able to resize the windows the way you want.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with that. And I think speaking of organizing the stages, one of the things I would like to do, assuming that we don't get a real macOS do whatever you want multi-window environment.
Right.
So if Stage Manager continues to be all we get, maybe one idea could be to remove the 4 windows per workspace limitation, but also bring in some consistency when it comes to keyboard related commands. So keyboard shortcuts for Stage Manager, more options for maybe resizing or placing windows on the right side or left side. I should be able in Spotlight, for example, on my iPad to do command space, then keyboard modifier, whatever, click on an icon, and it instantly gets added to my workspace. Right. I shouldn't have to pick it up and drag it into the workspace. Just let me click it, or let me have a hotkey that does that immediately. So yeah, keyboard shortcuts, but also shortcuts actions. Right now, Stage Manager, the only Stage Manager action it has is turn Stage Manager off or on. I should be able to assemble workspaces, basically make my own presets for workspaces using shortcuts. I can imagine make a workspace, make a stage with these windows. And if an app has multiple windows open, let me choose those windows. Let me filter those windows from shortcuts. Again, macOS, shortcuts on macOS, has all these actions to find and filter windows and move them. Shortcuts on iPad does not.
Yes, although you can't, with shortcuts, build workspaces in any more than you can on the iPad. So
you can't.
There's plenty of limits there.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, and lastly, for Stage Manager, I think it's also about time to rethink the app switcher UI. The last thing on my list is the grid view for the app switcher. I don't think it really scales well to an environment where you have overlapping windows. Essentially, what I'm saying is I want to have mission control on iPadOS. I want to be able to, if I have 4 windows going on at the same time in a workspace on my iPad Pro, let me have a bird's eye view of just those windows. Basically, mission control on macOS, right, which I love and use all the time.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. That would be nice to have. What should we hit next, do you think? Do you want to talk audio and video? I mean, that's one that we've talked about over and over during the years. And, we have heard rumors that Apple is going to add some things to iOS and iPadOS that are long-standing wishes from people. And boy, if they're listening to us, I hope those long-standing issues include addressing the fact that you can't pick and choose audio inputs, which I know that is something that you would like a lot too.
Yes, so audio and video, and being keeping on the idea of these are wishes that come from a place of this is the kind of stuff I need for my work. Mm-hmm. I need to be able. I want to be able to record podcasts on my iPad Pro with the same setup that I use on macOS, and frankly, I shouldn't have to care about these limitations, because here again, it's one of those things where here we have 2 platforms using the same chip architecture, one of them capable of doing something and the other it's not capable of doing it, and it's entirely political at this point. I don't believe, like, if you haven't built the proper audio and video stuff on iPadOS, it's because you chose not to do it, not because you can't, because you obviously can. And by this, let me get very practical here. So what if you're somebody at Apple and you're listening to this, like, okay, what does this guy actually need? I need to be able to plug in my USB interface, whether it's an Elgato Wave XLR or a USB Pre 2. And these are devices that you can use without additional drivers. We'll get to that in a minute. I need to be able to plug that in and have a screen in settings, like on macOS. You go to System Settings, Sound, and you have a beautiful page where you have 2 tabs for input and output. I need to be able to choose exactly from settings where do I want my sound to come from and where do I want it to come out. Basically, I need to be able to choose my microphone and to choose my earbuds as or any other sound output device. Let me choose that from settings and let it stick. That's only part of it. The other thing is, I need to be able to have multiple audio things happen at the same time. On macOS, for example, you can have a call with somebody on Skype or Zoom while recording your own local audio from your input source in an app running in the background. You can do that. Mm-hmm. As I'm talking to you right now, I could open Apple Music and put on a song, and I will hear both your voice and a song, which is not ideal, but I could do it. On macOS, you can open 2 videos at the same time, and it's not like one is going to pause the other. So support for multiple audio streams. Let me pick and choose my audio inputs, all my outputs, and allow me to have voice over IP calls, whether it's Skype or Zoom or FaceTime or whatever, and record my source audio while having those calls with other people. Basically, what you have on macOS, you can simplify it visually speaking, but that's what I need.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right now, not only am I recording my own local audio, but I'm also recording the Zoom call as a backup. So, those are 2 independent sources, but they're both being recorded to my my SSD. So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you want to talk about universal control? Because I see you have a few universal control things on your list.
Yeah, we should talk about universal control. One of the things that's probably the most frustrating about universal control, it's something I've never gotten over, which is that when I move my cursor over and I start controlling my iPad, but then I go back to my Mac, unless I click on something, when I go to the app switcher, Command tab. What am I saying? Alt tab. I sound like you now. When I command tab through my apps, it'll do it on my iPad and not on my Mac. And I just feel like I kind of get why that is, because the cursor is probably still in an app on the iPad, but I feel like with universal control, when I move my pointer back to the Mac, that the focus ought to return with it, the entire focus, not just not just the actual image of the pointer. It ought to bring back focus to the Mac itself, and maybe not to a particular app, maybe just to the Mac in general. But I don't want to have to Command Tab and see it Command tabbing over on the iPad instead. Mm-hmm. I would also, like to have the option to connect both a Mac and an iPad via Thunderbolt and, switch the display and peripherals between them in Control Center. So what I'm talking about here is like right now I'm using my Mac Studio. And if I connect a Thunderbolt cable from my iPad Pro to one of the Thunderbolt ports on my studio display, it's going to charge the iPad, but it's not going to display the iPad. I have to disconnect the Mac in order to have the iPad Pro run that display. I'd like to have the ability to do that in software so that I don't have to be plugging and unplugging things. Instead, whether it's a hub or it's something else, I'd like to be able to just do that switch in Control Center or some similar place. And then finally on universal control, why not make the studio display even more valuable? And when I plug into it, I get the benefit, if there's a Mac connected to it, to accessing its drives and its Ethernet connection, for instance. Can't do that right now. I mean, yeah, you could maybe, you can do it over the network. You can connect to external storage, but I don't have the kind of direct connection that I would have if the studio display was working more as a hub in between those things. And I'd like to be able to do that as well. It's another kind of power user feature that I think the iPad should have built into its OS, tighter connections and compatibility with Mac OS.
Yeah, these are interesting. My universal control wishes are more about the hardware than the software. Uh-huh. I still think Apple should make a version of the Magic Keyboard, the Bluetooth one, and the Magic Trackpad that supported multi-device pairing.
I would like that too.
That's all I want really in terms of like universal control. I want to have Apple devices that can support connecting to both my Mac and my iPad. Because again, the idea being I have a single desk, I have a single studio display, one Thunderbolt cable. I can swap in my MacBook Air and my iPad Pro, and I can keep using one set of accessories instead of having to use some Logitech accessories because those support multi-device pairing, but they're not as nice as the Magic Keyboard or the Magic Trackpad, which I do miss. However, it's more convenient to use something else. So those are my universal control-related wishes. We should talk about system-related wishes, just like we did for iOS, because I have a few. John, if you'll allow me. This one I also mentioned for iOS, so I won't spend too much time on it again, but I would love to have a clipboard manager. I mentioned the idea of build a clipboard manager into the system keyboard, into the Apple keyboard, and I still think that could work. On iPadOS, for example, imagine, just like you can have an emoji popover, which is effectively like a piece of the software keyboard that pops up anywhere on screen. Imagine if you could have a clipboard manager popover. Just like the emoji picker, you would have a clipboard picker, and it would appear anywhere you want with a single keyboard shortcut. The big idea for me, I guess, there's smaller stuff like, for example, one of the things I dislike about iPadOS, now that I'm using macOS, animations on iPadOS are so slow. Like everything animates so slowly compared to macOS. macOS you can configure. You can just, you click something and a window appears. And on iPadOS, it always feels like it's doing a whole swooshy thing where like it comes up slowly. Like, no, just make it, I feel like from my computer, just make the animation immediate. Don't make me wait even like a fraction of a second for animations to render beautifully. I get it. And this problem has only been exacerbated by Stage Manager, I think, and all the 3D animation stuff they have going on. Anyway, a big idea for me is I would love to see a third-party equivalent of QuickNote. Meaning, let me clarify. So QuickNote is a piece of UI of Apple Notes that you can invoke from anywhere. Right? It's like a little notes view controller that you can invoke from anywhere on iPadOS. I want that, but for all kinds of third-party apps. Like, I want to be able to invoke like a mini thing from, I don't know, Ivory or Mail or Obsidian from anywhere I want, and it's like a smaller window that I can use to perform quick tasks from anywhere on the system. And if you think about it, like, that's something you can do on macOS, right? On macOS, you have plenty of like mini UIs, whether they are menu bar apps or quick capture windows. Apps are able to summon a UI even if they're not in the foreground, even if they're not the frontmost window. That's something you can have with Notes on iPadOS, with Quick Note. I would love if iPadOS opened up a little bit for developers to be able to say, now users can invoke your app from anywhere, and they can assign a gesture or a keyboard shortcut or whatever, and you can invoke now, imagine the things or Todoist capture window, even if you're not inside things or Todoist. Like, that's the idea. That's already possible in an Apple app. I would love it if it could be possible for third-party developers too.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. Another thing I think that it is time for, we're talking about system apps, talking about the system itself, but there's also system apps and system settings. And system settings still doesn't work with Stage Manager, right? Yeah. And it's not the only app. It's not the only.
Well, it works, but the text is all tiny. That's the problem.
That's just something that, it needs to be cleaned up. I think that all the Apple system apps ought to be working with Stage Manager the way third-party developers are encouraged to work with Stage Manager too. So I'd like to see that happen this year. I mean, it's not like a huge thing, but I think it's an important thing, especially when the message is that developers should be supporting this too.
I agree.
What else, Federico? What should we talk about?
Okay.
I guess the Windows system is another. The windowing system to me has always been confusing. I still don't think it's quite right, and I don't really have a good solution.
What do you mean the windowing system?
I just mean like when you have multiple windows open.
Are we talking Stage Manager or not Stage Manager?
We're talking. Well, I think honestly, I think both of them. Non-Stage Manager, though, in particular.
Okay. So the shelf. You mean the shelf?
Yeah, the shelf that shows up. I just feel like, especially now that we have like the different way it works with Stage Manager, I find it a little confusing. But I mean, maybe that's just because I don't use iPadOS enough. But I've never really liked the shelf, and I find the fact that it's now more shrunken and harder to tell what those things are on the shelf, that it's not super useful to have it in the first place.
Yeah, I honestly think that the old expose window picker from iPadOS 13 used to be better. So I'm with you on that.
It was more modal, which I think in that situation, having something more modal was actually pretty good because it was easier to kind of pick out what you were trying to connect to.
Okay, so this is probably a big ask, as they say, but hey, that's why we're here. I want to be able to install whatever I want on my iPad, and yes. I would love to have a gatekeeper-based system on iPadOS. Just let me go out there and download. Because my iPad could be just as a pro machine as a MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air, and some types of software you cannot get from the App Store because technical limitations or economic incentives, whatever. Some developers only release software via their websites or GitHub repos. There's a whole open source community out there, just unable to make software for iPadOS because you don't have Gatekeeper on iPadOS. You don't have a way to install software from other sources that are not the App Store. And I think it's time for that to change. And kind of related to this, so last year, Apple rolled out DriverKit, which is a framework for third-party hardware makers to make iPadOS compatible drivers and release them on the App Store. I haven't seen a single DriverKit enabled app on my radar for the past year at all. So I don't know what this is. I don't know if this is like just the fact that, why would you? Why would you go out and spend time to make an iPadOS compatible DriverKit enabled driver if then the OS doesn't let you do so many things? So I'm guessing that the the interest of hardware makers are just not aligned with the platform. But if I were Apple, I would say, okay, maybe we should evangelize this technology, go out there, talk to, these audio makers, for example, that make audio peripherals, and talk to these folks who make camera peripherals, and talk to them and have a conversation and be like, why are you not using DriverKit? You should be using DriverKit. Or if DriverKit is not the solution, then maybe scrap it and do something else. But yeah, figure out how I should be able to plug whatever I want into my iPad Pro and it should get recognized. I don't know how, but that's the way it should be.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of mail extensions, which we didn't, that came to the Mac and we didn't see any really for a year. There are some now, but it took a very long time for them to catch on. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that what was enabled was pretty limited in terms of what you could do compared to what people were doing before Apple went to that extension framework for mail. And, maybe we'll talk about that more with Mac OS. Maybe that'll expand over time and there'll be more options. It'll become more popular. But some of these things are pretty slow burn, and DriverKit really definitely falls in that camp, I think.
Yeah.
Another thing, Federico, lock screen widgets. Why don't we have those on the iPad, right? Especially if Apple has you in universal control there with, your iPad sitting next to your display. Maybe you're not using it for universal control for a while. It would be nice to have lock screen widgets. Now, we don't have an always on display for the iPad, so maybe they're not quite as useful in that context, but I'd love to see them come to the iPad anyway, so that I can just with a quick tap get to my lock screen and maybe see what the weather is or catch a notification of some kind that's in a particular app's widget. So, and you know what, maybe even always on display for the iPad someday will be possible. It's a much larger display though, so I assume that's a battery hardware issue more than anything else. But I do think in the future that's something we might see, especially if Apple goes to OLED displays.
Yeah, I agree. The last thing I will mention, I don't think Spotlight is good enough. Spotlight Search. And it's definitely not as good as stuff like Alfred or my favorite Raycast on Mac.
It's very slow. I don't
Spotlight is slow. It's so slow. It's unreliable. Sometimes you type the name of something that you're sure you have, whether it's an app or a shortcut, and it doesn't find it. And then you backspace a little and suddenly it finds it.
Right. It shows the App Store entry for an app that you've got installed. Yeah. And I've had that experience over and over again. Yep.
Spotlight should be faster. Again, fewer animations. Just make it faster. Improve the experience of launching and running shortcuts from Spotlight. Running Apple-made shortcuts via the Apple-made Spotlight should exceed, in terms of user experience and quality, what you can do in Raycast. And right now, the best launcher for shortcuts is not made by Apple. And I think that's absurd. The best experience, the default, should come from Apple. And another idea I have, again, inspired by Raycast, Apple, and they love to convince developers to make extensions of all kinds. Extensions for the lock screen, they're called widgets. For the home screen, they're also called widgets. For the share sheet, for the watch, for CarPlay, the entire iOS app architecture is now based on so many different types of extensions. Shortcuts actions are, intents are a type of extension. Well, Spotlight extensions. That's my pitch. Okay, so imagine having commands just like in Raycast, but native extensions for your apps, so that you will be able to accomplish stuff. We were talking before about like the ability to have little UIs from third-party apps appear anywhere on the system. Maybe Spotlight is the way to make that happen. A native extension in Spotlight that, imagine, showed you a little calendar view from Fantastical, or give you the ability to save up to-do in things from Spotlight. Maybe Spotlight is the answer to have this sort of background UIs coming from third-party apps, even if you're not using them, because Spotlight is the one true sort of universal layer of interface on iPadOS that you can get to from anywhere if you just press Command Space. So maybe it's time for native extension to live in Spotlight on the iPad.
Yes, and extensions that can take information too. That you can type text into. Yeah. So like you said, so you can do the quick event in your calendar, or the quick reminder in reminders or things or Todoist or something like that. Yeah, that would be fantastic. I mean, I think it would be. I think Spotlight actually got slower with iPadOS 16 and iOS 16 for that matter. I mean, I can't remember. Was it iOS 15 where they worked on it and it did definitely
it was
not
15,
that long.
It got better, then it got worse. Yes.
Yep, exactly. It got quite a bit better. And now I would say it's back kind of where it was in iOS 14 days, probably. All right, Federico, that's it for another Wishes episode. Next week, we are going to talk about watchOS and tvOS. We know, there's lots of wishes for tvOS. I actually have a lot for the watch. So
okay.
I'm looking forward to that episode. I want to thank our sponsor again for this episode, which is ZocDoc. You can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net. We are also on Mastodon. Just go to vitici.macstories.net to follow Federico, or johnvorhees.macstories.net to follow me. And we're on Instagram, where Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.